Hey, everybody, welcome back. We're on lesson number 6 of the COVID-19 pandemic briefing. In this lesson, we're going to continue learning about the pathophysiology of COVID-19, which is to say what it does to your body to make you sick. So we looked at this model right here, just saying that the virus comes into your cell, makes a whole bunch of copies, and that ends up killing the cell and spreading the virus to other cells. But we're going to understand the details of that a little better. So before we can understand what it does to make you sick, we have to make sure that we understand how everything works when it's working well. So this is a respiratory disease, so we need to learn about respiration, which is the flow of blood through your lungs and through your heart and through your body, and how that blood transports carbon dioxide and oxygen. So we looked at this model last time. So this time we're going to look at what's happening inside of the body, and then we're going to look at what's happening inside of the lungs with respiration. So here's some blood. If you took some blood and you put it into a test tube, and you put that test tube in a centrifuge and spun it down really fast, all the heavier stuff would go down to the bottom of the tube, and the lighter stuff would rise up to the top of the tube. And here's what we would end up with. We would end up with a layer of cells, and we would end up with a layer of what's called plasma, blood plasma. So here we can look at this a little bit more closely. So the plasma, which is the lighter stuff, which is free of cells, is made of water. It's made of a solution of water with proteins, nutrients, hormones, antibodies, and this plasma is going to be important to us when we're talking about different ways that you can treat the disease. But for now, we're talking about how the disease works, so we're going to focus down here on this hematocrit. So the hematocrit has red blood cells in it. So in normal blood, this is the proportion of red blood cells that you would have. If you're anemic, that would mean that you have less. See how there's less red blood cells and more plasma in somebody who is suffering from anemia? And then if somebody who has polycythemia would have elevated levels of red blood cells. So anemia can be caused by lack of iron in the diet. It can be caused by internal bleeding, and polycythemia can be caused by extended periods of time spent at high elevation. So if you're spending a lot of time in an area that has less oxygen than normal, your body can respond by making extra red blood cells, and this is what your blood layers would look like. Okay, so what's next? So here we are back to this model right here. We're going to focus on this part. I know it's hard to see, but you remember we colored this red to represent oxygenated blood, and we colored this blue to represent deoxygenated blood, or blood that's high in carbon dioxide. So we're focusing on this area right here of the model where the transition happens between oxygenation and deoxygenation. So that transition happens in a structure called a capillary. So what a capillary is a really small blood vessel. So we can start over here, and this model is using the same. It's using red to show oxygenated blood and blue to show deoxygenated blood. So a tube in your body that carries oxygenated blood is called an artery. And arteries split into smaller tubes carrying oxygenated blood called arterioles. And then they go into even smaller tubes that are called capillaries. So we're going to be spending the rest of this lecture talking about capillaries. So capillaries is where the blood goes from being oxygenated, which is red in this model, to deoxygenated, which is blue in this model. And remember, deoxygenated blood is not actually blue. So we're just using that in the model. So those capillaries can go on to fuse to form venules and veins. So veins are tubes that carry deoxygenated blood. So we're going to talk about these capillaries right in here. So we got oxygenated blood, remember, coming from the lungs. See right here from the lungs, this oxygenated blood. And then we've got deoxygenated blood, which is going to be pumped from the heart back up into the lungs. Fine then. This is from Body Worlds, which is an exhibit of human bodies where different tissues have been plasticized so that you can sort of have a dissection that is sort of permanent and you can just see it really well. So here we are with a bunch of blood vessels, and the littlest itty bitty ones, all these down here, those are the capillaries. And you can see that if you took away all the bone and all the skin and all the muscle and all the fat, you would be left with quite a lot of tissue that is devoted to the transport of blood. So here's these capillaries again right here. This is just another model. And what's nice about this model is it shows you structural differences between arteries, which are the tubes that carry oxygenated blood, and veins, which are the tubes that carry deoxygenated blood, and capillaries, which is where the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen occurs. So if you look at the artery, it's got a thick layer of connective tissue. The vein has a layer of connective tissue that's pretty thick also. And here in the capillary, not much connective tissue at all. The capillary also has a big fat layer of muscle and some muscle here in the vein, but no muscle in the capillary. The artery needs to have this thick layer of muscle and this thick layer of connective tissue because the blood in the artery is under higher pressure than it is in the vein. On the innermost portion of the tube is epithelium. And epithelium is made out of these flat cells that we're going to talk about here. So remember, we're talking about capillaries, and all capillaries have really is this epithelium, which is this thin layer of cells. Sorry about the fuzziness here, but I do like this model. So here's one of those capillary tubes. Here's a cross section of it right here. And here's these blood cells in here, red blood cells. And what happens is molecules can leak through the walls of the tube in order to enter cells that are in the body and tissue. So this could be like heart muscle cells or fat cells or skin cells, bone cells, whatever. All cells are supported by capillaries. So here we are having molecules diffuse out of this capillary to support these cells. And these cells take those molecules, they do chemical reactions to them, and it ends up producing waste products, one of which is carbon dioxide. But those waste products can then can diffuse out of these tissue cells and into this capillary, and then they can go into the blood where those waste products can be removed by the lungs or the kidneys or the liver. So here's this same process. It's just kind of like a little more detailed. Here we are with this capillary. These blood cells cannot leave the capillary. If they do leave the capillary, that's when you're getting internal bleeding, and that's not so good. So under normal conditions, these cells are too big to fit through the little pores and cracks in this epithelium of this what do you call it again? Capillary again. So what leaves the capillary? Water leaves the capillary. Amino acids leave the capillary. Oxygen, glucose, and other things will leave the capillary. And the reason they're leaving primarily is due to diffusion. So the concentration of these chemicals is higher inside the capillary and lower outside the capillary. So that's why it leaves. Other things that are in there that might have a concentration gradient also can't leave because they're too big. Same thing here. If we have a whole bunch of carbon dioxide in your muscles because you're running a mile or something like that, then the concentration of carbon dioxide is going to be greater in your muscle tissue than it is inside of your capillary. So that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into your blood. So that is called capillary exchange. It's a trading of chemicals. We got chemicals coming out and we got chemicals going in. Okay, here we are back at this model right here. So capillaries are right here. They're at this exchange inside of the body right there. But capillaries are also, where else is exchange happening in this model? That's right. The exchange is happening up here in the lungs. And what's getting exchanged? Carbon dioxide is going to leave the lungs and oxygen is going to enter the lungs. Or excuse me, carbon dioxide is going to leave the blood at the lungs and oxygen is going to enter the blood at the lungs. So capillaries are down here in the body, but they're also up here in the lungs. So this is what we're going to focus on next. So here we are with some lungs right here. The lungs have multiple lobes and air, it enters the lungs and then it leaves the lungs the same way it came. It's not a one way, like for example, blood in this system right here is one way. It just goes dink, dink, dink. It just goes one way. And that's not like that with the lungs. Or in the lungs, it's two ways. The air goes in and the air goes out. The air goes in and the air goes out. And when it comes in, it splits into all these branches that are called bronchi. So as the air comes in, it reaches these dead ends here. And at these dead ends are these grape looking things that are called alveoli. So alveoli is plural for these sacs that are full of air, and alveolus is singular for one of these sacs full of air. And each one of these sacs that fills and empties with air is completely surrounded with capillaries. So here's oxygenated blood coming to the alveolus, and here's deoxygenated blood leaving the alveolus. So let's zoom in on that a little better and see what's going on there. So here's these capillaries that are surrounding this alveolus. We have air coming into this hollow sac looking thing, and we've got air leaving. And when the air comes in, it's higher in concentration of oxygen than it is when it leaves. And when the air comes in, it's lower in concentration of carbon dioxide than it is when it leaves. I'll let you rewind that and listen to it a couple times so you can understand what I'm talking about. So here's what happens. That air comes in and then blood that's coming from the body that's rich in carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide leaves the blood through the little holes in the capillary, and the carbon dioxide goes into the air. So the carbon dioxide leaves the blood and enters the air, and then it's gone. Meanwhile, oxygen from an inhale comes and it leaves the air and enters the blood. And it's all just due to diffusion. It's all passive. The concentration of carbon dioxide is greater in the blood and less in the air. So it leaves the blood and enters the air. Conversely, the concentration of oxygen is greater in the air and less in the blood, and therefore oxygen leaves the air and enters the blood. And that, friends, is how respiration works.